Here's a quiz question that few people, even those who consider themselves news junkies, can answer correctly. Can you name the country that's still fighting the world's longest-running civil war, one that has claimed more than 220,000 lives, left another 45,000 people missing, and displaced 6.7 million? The answer is Colombia. The war there has lasted 60 years, but given a peace process that began in 2012, an end to that conflict is now in sight. The government of President Juan Manuel Santos and the leftist guerrilla group FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, are set to sign an historic peace agreement. But as this story moves forward, are the mainstream news media in Colombia ready, willing to move with it? The country's former president, Álvaro Uribe, has launched a media campaign to discredit the FARC and the peace process itself, one that many news outlets have been willing to share. To counter that viewpoint, the FARC have started waging their own media campaign. They are the latest set of Latin American revolutionaries trying to recast themselves as legitimate political players. When President Santos puts the final deal to a vote in a national referendum, the Colombian electorate will need to know what's on the table. They'll be counting on their news media for balance and context. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the role of journalism in the peace and reconciliation process in Colombia.
El grupo terrorista de las FARC. Tune into the mainstream news coverage on the peace talks between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas, and you'll get this.
Las contradicciones de las FARC que, al mismo tiempo que negocian un modelo de paz en Cuba con el gobierno colombiano, en Colombia intensifican su acción terrorista.
Click onto Nueva Colombia, the New Colombia, a news channel set up on YouTube by the FARC themselves, and you'll get this.
Se acerca el fin de la guerra. Importantes avances hacia el logro de un acuerdo de cese del fuego y hostilidades.
Los únicos que transmitían eran los medios de comunicación grandes.
The mainstream networks were covering this 24/7. They were the only ones with the funds and resources needed to keep journalists here waiting for the news to happen. We were the actual source of the news. We needed to do the reporting ourselves. The question was how. The internet was the only way to do this quickly. And that's how we've started doing what we're doing now, explaining to people what our political project is all about, and doing this in a clear, engaging way.
Duramos mucho tiempo invisibilizados.
For a long time, we were invisible. We weren't really able to get the FARC's message out there, to communicate our values and ideology. All we could do was to fight with our guns, to repel the continuous attacks. Communication suffered, though. We just didn't have the opportunity. Once we had all the comforts of a studio, you can imagine the difference between being out there in the jungle to being here in the city. Here we have all the equipment, the internet, social media, Facebook and Twitter accounts, the YouTube channel, the whole lot.
Todas las redes habidas y por ahí.
The FARC's press wing, former guerrillas turned broadcasters operating out of Havana, Cuba, may be telegenic, but they're only getting a few thousand clicks a week.
¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Somos Nueva Colombia Noticias, informando para la paz desde la capital cubana.
But most Colombians get their news from the big TV and radio stations, RCN, Caracol, NTN 24, privately owned outlets that have millions of viewers. They've been telling the story of a conflict over land rights, which has pitted Marxist rebels claiming to fight on behalf of the country's peasants, but whose rebellion runs on drugs profits, against government and paramilitary forces. After 6 decades of this conflict, Colombians are sick and tired of the violence. While the government tries to de-escalate the language of war,
en lugar de decirles estos bandidos narcotraficantes, terroristas, pues referirse a las FARC.
the media have insisted on ramping it up.
No decirles narcotraficantes, bueno, tienen negocio de narcotraficantes, no decirles criminales, cometen crímenes y atroces todos los días.
Las FARC han sido vistas.
The FARC have been seen, not just in Colombia, but all over the world, as a terrorist group. To dissociate them from drug trafficking, from kidnapping and extortion, from forced child recruitment and human rights abuses is very difficult. That background is what has made the negotiation so difficult, because for a sector of the population, the FARC will always be a criminal gang with no political agenda.
Sin ningún componente político.
Las FARC solo se le mira desde sus delitos.
The FARC are only considered from the perspective of their crimes. No one takes into account their ideals or the political positions they stand for. The narrative is steeped in legality and criminality.
El gobierno y las FARC anunciaron hace pocos minutos un acuerdo que obligaría al grupo criminal a liberar de sus filas a los menores de 15 años.
I think it's a narrative that has been strongly depoliticized. Of course, it's not a narrative that has been completely invented, as the FARC claims. They have perpetrated criminal acts which are not appropriate for a revolutionary or a political organization.
Una organización política.
One man who's done his best to undermine the FARC's legitimacy is Colombia's former president, Álvaro Uribe. During his time in office, Uribe waged an aggressive war against the FARC. Plan Colombia, it was called, a $9 billion campaign funded by the US. It was post 9/11, and the narrative was the war on terror. In 2010, Uribe handpicked his successor, Juan Manuel Santos, his defense minister. But when Santos staked his presidency on signing a peace deal with the rebels, Uribe became his most powerful opponent. Since then, he's been waging a one-man Twitter war against Santos and the peace talks. And with more than 4 million followers and the ear of the mainstream media, his message has a significant impact.
Álvaro Uribe es una figura emblemática.
Álvaro Uribe is an emblematic figure in Colombia and a natural-born communicator. His positions regarding the peace process always generate interest in Colombia. He has been clearly against the process. He has put many obstacles in front of it and led the opposition against it.
His strategy of sabotaging the peace process is a strategy steeped in lies. He does this on Twitter, and this has an immediate impact on the media. This creates headlines. It becomes compulsory to talk to Uribe. And I think this has been the main factor in creating a public opinion that is against the peace process.
De opinión adverso al proceso de paz.
Yo sí creo que la narrativa de la guerra que ha impuesto Uribe.
The narrative of war imposed by Uribe has changed the way we do journalism here in a big way. If I interview FARC leaders, I can't do a simple interview like this. I have to be hard on them, as if they don't deserve to be seated there. This is the result of the war narrative. It forces Colombian journalists to be very hard on the FARC for fear of being stigmatized as guerrilla-friendly journalists.
Estigmatizados como si fuéramos periodistas de la guerrilla.
That stigma persists, and moving the story on, covering a peace deal with an adversary long considered the enemy, is proving a challenge.
Cuando comenzamos, seguíamos en guerra.
When the talks began, war was still being waged by the media, so we were a bit reluctant to engage with them because we were fed up with the harassment and slandering. We felt like the cameras were guns being pointed at us. We've been asking them to tone it down and to acknowledge their active role in the conflict. So at least now we've gone from terrorists to insurgents, which is progress, I suppose.
Que eso de todas maneras es un avance.
A uno le costó mucho trabajo abrir camino.
At the start of the talks, it was very hard for me to have access to the FARC. They didn't want to give me an interview because they consider the media to go against everything they stand for. That's been changing, little by little. They've come to see that there are nuances, and that there are journalists reporting what's happening in Havana, who understand that the FARC need to have a media presence and to voice their opinion. This has been a mutual learning curve. It's a shame that the other media have not done the same.
Lástima que no lo hayan hecho los demás medios.
And probably won't for a while. And that's a problem for Colombians, because it's not just politicians who can broker peace. In a society scarred by war, the media also have a role to produce responsible accounts of the past, to show what's at stake in the present, for society to make its decision for the future.
Beyond the polarized points of view presented in the Colombian media, there is more nuanced journalism available, but you have to look for it online. La Silla Vacía, the empty chair, is a news and analysis site. The name refers to peace talks that failed back in 1999 when FARC's leader at the time refused to attend, leaving a key chair empty. The site was set up by journalist Juanita León, one of the first reporters to expose links between Colombian politicians and paramilitary groups. Las Dos Orillas, which means the two shores, is an online news site set up in 2013 by Maria Elvira Bonilla, former head of news at RCN. This site tries to decentralize the story since most of the national media in Colombia are Bogota-centric. Las Dos Orillas focuses on news from the two Colombian coastlines and provides a different narrative. In the piece, one of our interviewees referred to the absence of the victim's narrative in mainstream coverage of this conflict. One online site concentrating on that angle, as well as peace and reconciliation, is Verdad Abierta, which translates to open truth.